Thank you. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a great pleasure to me to come to Timaru to speak about Colin McCahon. Timaru, of course, was his birthplace. In 1919, his parents lived at that stage in Dunedin, but his mother came home to her parents' place, the Ferries, to Timaru in order for the birth to take place, and then subsequently returned to Dunedin, but Timaru was his birthplace. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about these two books that I've produced. But before I do that, I'm going to say a little bit about the works on the wall, which are the very choice little collection of McCahon's in the collection of this gallery. So that's where I'm going to begin. So the four works that are in this collection all come from quite a tight period of Colin's career. His active career as an artist, extended about 45 years. If you measure from when he first went to art school as a 16 or 17-year-old in 1937 to 1982, when he painted his last works, it's about 45 years. He did live on for 4 or 5 years after he stopped painting. He was too ill to continue painting in the last few years of his life, but he did have a very long career and an enormously prolific career. The Colin McCahon website, which some of you might have looked at, and which records every known work, has about 1,800 works on it, and they're being added to all the time. I am a member of a committee which one of its jobs is to validate or authenticate new works for the addition to the website. And the last meeting we had last year sometime, we looked at 70 new works. These are works which have emerged in the last year or two, and it's happening all the time. What his total output was, I'm not sure, but it would have been at least 2,000 works, which is huge. Four is not a very large proportion of 2,000. But the thing about Colin, and this is my belief anyway, is that he never made an uninteresting work. I'm not saying that all of his works were masterpieces. I'm sure that they weren't. And he himself was well aware that there was a difference in quality between some works and others. But I chose my words carefully. He never made an uninteresting work. Even the smallest scrap of charcoal on paper has interest to me anyway. As it happens, I think that these four works are very good, very high quality works, and all of them are interesting. So they belong to the period 1966 to 1976, a single decade within his 45-year span of his career. So they're all mature works. He painted up until 1981 or 2, so they belong to not the last decade, but the last period of his career. So the work on screen at the moment, North Otago 5, is from 1966. It's one of a group of 6 paintings, and they're made on handmade paper. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that the paper has rather crinkly edges, and that's because it's handmade, and that was quite rare. There are not many examples that I can think of where Colin worked on handmade paper, but he did in the case of this particular group. Now, North Otago was quite important to Colin, partly because he did actually spend a couple of years living in Oamaru as a schoolboy at the age of 12 or 11 or 12. For some reason, during the Depression, his family moved from Dunedin to Oamaru briefly, and he went to, I think he completed primary school at Aigantighe Junior High School or whatever it was called. And he loved Oamaru and remembered very fondly that period of his life. And in the 1960s, he returned to that landscape to paint it on many, many occasions. He also painted South Canterbury, and I'll show you 1 or 2 examples of that later on. But North Otago in particular, the landscape around Oamaru had particular meaning for him. And he was always very sensitive to landscape, and whether he was living in Nelson or Christchurch or Dunedin or Titirangi or wherever it might be, the landscape of the particular neighbourhoods or environment was always important to him. But it was quite uncommon for him to revert to an earlier landscape once he had moved on, but that was the case with North Otago. I think there were a couple of reasons for it. One was that he began returning, after he retired from being a lecturer at Elam School of Art, he moved to Auckland in 1953 to a job at the Auckland Art Gallery and stayed there for 12 years. After that, he got a job teaching at Elam School of Art at the University of Auckland and was at Elam for 7 years before retiring in 1971 to paint full-time. But even after he retired from Elam, he used to come to the South Island to take part in a summer school at Kurau in the Waitaki Valley. And I think that those return trips to the South Island and to North Otago in particular reminded him of childhood experiences, and he began to paint quite frequently. And this was the first series that he began with. And I'll just show you a few other examples. I think these are North Otago 1, 2, and 3. This one here is number 5, and there are 6 altogether, but these are 3 other examples, all on handmade paper, and all with the same simplified landscape, banded horizontal bands of colour, which was one of his most recurrent motifs. They're not always easy to read from a realist point of view. What are you looking at? In the case of this one here, is it sky, hill? Is that a river or is it a plain? You know, it's not always easy to say exactly what each band represents, but the horizontal structure of the land was always very important to him, particularly the point at which the horizon, I think there may be 2 horizons in this particular example, and one of the ways where his skill as a painter shows itself is at those horizon points. There's a wonderful delicacy about the fudged sort of, it's not a straight line, it's not a clear demarcation, it's a very beautifully constructed zone between the two conditions. Now, the same year as he did those 6 North Otago paintings, he did this enormous work which I've stretched across the top of, which the title of which is The 14 Stations of the Cross. And I'm sure that you will immediately recognize how similar those paintings are. And I've shown the first 3 in larger size because they are quite close to the one on the right, which is the work in this collection. So the 14 Stations of the Cross, this work was painted at a time when McCahon was collaborating with an architect on a Roman Catholic chapel in Remuera in Auckland. He was not himself a Roman Catholic, and he was brought up as a Presbyterian, and in subsequent life, although he was very interested in religion, he never joined a particular church. And he was interested in Catholicism, and I think he even undertook some instruction in the Catholic Church, but never finally became a member of the church. But the Stations of the Cross, of course, is a very common feature of Roman Catholic churches, and not only Roman Catholic churches, of course, Anglican and some other Protestant churches also utilize the notion of the Stations of the Cross, which is, of course, a narrative of the last day or days of Jesus before his crucifixion, the events leading up to his crucifixion. And having discovered this motif through his researching of Roman Catholic iconography, Colin, it became absolutely central to his practice, and I think there are probably about 30 different versions of the Stations of the Cross in his later work, some of which I'll show you later on. So it did become very important to him as a kind of structuring device, as an armature for the paintings that he wanted to make. In this case, the stations are landscapes, simplified North Otago landscapes. And his idea was that, you know, each station is written along the bottom. You know, he takes up the cross, you know, he falls for the first time, he speaks to his mother, his face is wiped by Veronica, etc., right down to he is crucified, you know, he is laid in the tomb. So it's a narrative, a sequential narrative of events. But in this case, each moment is rendered in terms of landscape. And so you'll notice, for example, that you know, some of them have a light color in the sky and some of them have a dark color in the sky. It's a kind of emotional journey, and he's responding to each of the stations in turn as he paints it. So that little North Otago series was very important to him in opening out this landscape as the area in which he explored some of his deepest religious and spiritual concerns. And North Otago continued as important in his work. In 1967, he did another whole series of paintings based on the North Otago landscape. So the second work I'll refer to is the small charcoal drawing behind me. Kurau, little town in the Waitaki Valley was where, I think it was the University of Otago, held a summer school every summer, every January, and quite a number of important artists. Doris Lusk was another, went there to teach. And Colin, on several occasions, 3 or 4 I think, came down to teach in the January summer school at Kurau. And he did a number of works, not a great many, probably about half a dozen or maybe 8 or 9. This on the right, this is the catalogue from an exhibition he held at the Barry Lett Galleries in Auckland, which was his main dealer gallery in Auckland. Peter McLeavy represented him in Wellington, and this was an exhibition from the summer of 1971-72, Muriwai and Kurau. Muriwai was where Colin had a studio. On Muriwai is the beach northwest of Auckland, where he had a studio. So these were paintings deriving from those 2 separate locations. So this is just a small charcoal drawing, but I think that a feature of Colin's work is that it has a kind of monumentality, even if the scale is quite small. And there's a kind of extraordinary hilliness about that hill, which makes it a remarkable work, even though it's quite casual in relation to, say, some of the others. Like these are 2 of the other works that were done in that same period. These are quite large works, they're 1 metre by 800 millimetres or something like that. So they're big, substantial watercolours or acrylic paintings, more important, I suppose, in a way, than the charcoal drawing, but nonetheless, as I say, he never did an uninteresting work, and I believe that is an important little drawing. These are a couple of other works that draw on Kurau as a location, hotel meals, rather ironic sort of juxtaposition, and the language up here, keep yourself safe, is that what it says? It comes from the Bible anyway, as so many of Colin's texts do come from the Bible. So the third one, in memory of Daisy Le Crème, this gorgeous little painting here. I noticed that there's a Le Crème street directly opposite the gallery, and the Le Crème family is obviously well known in these parts. And Colin knew Daisy Le Crème. Her daughter was Betty, who married the poet Alan Curnow. And Alan and Betty had several sons, one of whom is Wystan Curnow, who is a well-known McCahon writer and scholar. Betty herself was an artist, and so was her mother. And Colin, I'm not sure when he knew, I think probably when he was young, because I discovered a letter that I haven't got the text with me, but I'm going to summarise what he said. A lot of my research for these books is based on Colin's letters. He was had a huge correspondence. I would say, I don't know, thousands of letters. And he had a dozen or 20 people that he wrote to on a regular basis. Often they were friends or his parents or his sister, friends like Doris Lusk and Charles Brash, Rodney Kennedy. Anyway, in one of his letters to Rodney Kennedy, which is in fact addressed to Kennedy's cat. Colin was a cat person. He said, "Oh, I've just done 16 little paintings for Betty Lecren." He said, her paintings used to hang at the end of the bed, were hung at the end of the bed in Christchurch Hospital. He said, and people got well. And he said, in these paintings I copy her, and I'm trying to convey something of her faith, but probably not very successfully, but I tried. So these are, I think, the smallest paintings he ever made, these tiny little pieces on cardboard. But I think they illustrate the point that I was making about how even though the work might be physically small, it's not small in conception. You could imagine these works blown up to 20 times their size, and they would still carry the viewer. That's a feature of his work, I think, that it's monumental even at tiny sizes. Yes, I'm thrilled to see this work. I've never seen it before. Unfortunately, it's not in my book, but I'm delighted to see it in the flesh for the first time. Absolutely central to Colin's vision is light and dark. Black and white, or colour and dark colour and light colour. His conception of art was that central to art is the idea of contrast. He loved to quote Cézanne, "To paint is to contrast." And if you think of that, it often makes sense of all sorts of different kinds of things that he does. Light against dark, bright colour against soft colour, curved against straight. The principle of contrast is absolutely central to his vision. Here are another 4 of the little Daisy Lecren panels. And finally, the work that I think of as probably the most important of the 4 works in this collection, Red and Black. It belongs to a series of which there are only 3. He called them the red ones. And so there's red and black, and then black and red on the right. And here's the 3rd one, Throw Out the Lifeline, it's called. And they all belong to the year 1976. It was unusual for him to use red, but in this instance he did. In the case of Red and Black, I'll just make a couple of points about it. As Colin developed, his style got simpler and simpler, radically simple, daringly simple in many cases, and as compared to the sometimes quite elaborate landscapes of early in his career. But so his methodology got pared down, more and more simple as time went on. But at the same time, his paintings got deeper and deeper. And this was the trick that he learned how to do, was to make his paintings both simpler and more complex simultaneously. And I'll show you this is a good example of one way in which he did that. You know the terms figure and ground, figure and background. Now, if you take red as being figure and black as being ground, you have a T shape. If you take black as being figure and red as being ground, you have 2 massive blocks of rock if you like. If you know Colin's work well, you'll realize that this motif derives from Muruwai, from the cliffs at Muruwai, where there's an island stack just offshore and a cliff of the mainland. And that motif of the two vertical rectangles was repeated over and over in his work. We'll see examples of it later. But so that's an example. You can read it as a landscape painting with black forms against a red back sky, shall we say, or as a symbolist painting, using the symbol of the letter T. Now, in Colin's work, the T is always a form of the cross, but he much preferred the T-shaped cross to the more conventional Latin cross. And the form of the cross is called the Tau, T-A-U, and it's a very ancient form of cross which existed before Christianity. Moses was often associated with the Tau cross, for example. So the T shape always has spiritual connotations for him. The other thing about this painting which strikes me is that the simplicity with which he has painted it. I don't know, I imagine he used several strokes to create the thick red paint of the horizontal, but for the vertical he's just taken a brush and slashed it, one stroke down the center of the painting. It's sort of almost like action painting in the sense that was used of American painters like Jackson Pollock and so forth. But it shows an enormous confidence just to do a single stroke of red through the black. All right, that's the collection that I've dealt with, and I'm going to. Oh, this one, I'll just say a bit about this one. This is a much more complex painting than either of the other two. And Colin was absolutely thrilled when he heard that it had been bought by somebody brought up in the Salvation Army. And he said, it's a real Salvationist job. And throwing out the lifeline, it is the sort of metaphor that is often, I suppose, used in a kind of spiritual context of somebody drowning or in desperate straits, looking for solace or redemption or whatever it might be. It's a wonderful painting, I think. All right, I'm going to switch now to my books, and I'll just say of them that when I set out to write it, I intended to write a book, not two books. And that's what I did. I wrote a book. But when I delivered it to my publisher, he said, this is too big for one book. I think we should go to 2 volumes. So it was very late in the process that it became 2 volumes. And having made that decision, we had to decide where to divide the material. Since I was my study was chronological, it was relatively easy. We just had to decide which point to end volume 1 and to start volume 2. And we chose the year 1960, partly so that the 2 books were of a similar size, but it was also a very important watershed, if you like, in his work. When the McCahon family first moved to Auckland, they lived at Titirangi, out on the shores of the Manukau Harbour in the kauri forest. And he used to have to travel an hour into work every day at the art gallery because Titirangi is out, as you probably know, out on the western edge of the city. But they lived in that little house in the kauri forest until 1960. And It was a tiny little cottage. It's open now as a museum. Some of you have probably visited it. And the thing that everybody is amazed by is how did you bring up a family of 6 children in such a tiny little batch? But they did somehow. Anyway, by 1960, the children had grown to teenagers and they needed more space. And so he moved into the city, into the central, first of all, basically Grey Lynn was the area he lived in, Newton, near the Newton Gully in the first instance, and then later in Grey Lynn. But one of the characteristics of Colin was that whenever he moved to a new place, it took him quite a long time before he started painting again. When he moved to Auckland, for example, it was at least 6 months before he did any paintings. And when he moved into the city from Titirangi, it was almost a year before he started painting again. That partly had to do with the fact that practical matters like preparing the house for the family and, do-it-yourself carpentry and that kind of thing. But also, he was very sensitive to his physical environment, and he needed to learn how to see a place or an area before he felt confident of beginning to make paintings based on it. Now, when I planned my book, I decided that it would have 14 chapters, 14 stations of the cross, I suppose you could say. And when I divided it in 2, I put 7 chapters in each volume. And what I've decided to do for this talk is that I've chosen 3 images for each chapter. Now, sometimes I'm choosing 3 out of 200. It's not easy to represent such a huge, copious artist with a small number of images, but we'd be here all night if I chose too many more. So 3 images it is from each chapter, and the chapters are all chronological. And in some cases they're famous paintings, in other cases they're not so famous, and sometimes I've chosen them almost randomly. Okay, so we start with Colin as a 20-year-old in 1939, and this painting called Harbicone from Peggy's Hill, which is, of course, a landscape of the Otago Peninsula. And I think it's probably fair to say that Colin taught himself to paint by painting the Otago Peninsula. And there are 3 major paintings of the peninsula, 3 of the largest works he ever did, spread through the 1940s as he got more and more confident as to how to paint. And this was the very first of them, painted when he was 20. There's a couple of things to say about it. One was that a characteristic of his landscape style was that he got rid of all surface detail. No roads, no houses, no power pylons, just the basic geology of the land. And a huge influence on him was the geologist Charles Cotton, Sir Charles Cotton, who published a famous book on the geomorphology of New Zealand, which I used as a textbook when I was a student in the 1960s. And throughout that book, Cotton illustrated New Zealand landforms and things like, river valleys and the various effects of erosion and that sort of thing. He illustrated sometimes with photographs, but often with line drawings. Colin absolutely loved his line drawings. There are something like 300 or 400 line drawings in geomorphology. And when Colin found them, he said, right, that's the way I want to study the landscape. So everything is stripped back to its elements, if you like, its geomorphological elements. A second point about this particular painting is that Colin's career was riven with controversy from beginning to end. He was the most controversial New Zealand artist and remains so, I think. And that tendency to be involved in controversy started early. As a student at the Dunedin School of Art, he became a member, along with his fellow students like Doris Lusk and his wife, Anne Hamblett, became a member of the Otago Society of Arts. And if you were a member, you had the right to include one work in the annual exhibition of the Otago Society of Arts. That was your right as a member. So Colin, in 1940, Colin submitted this painting to the Otago Society of Arts, and they refused to hang it. They thought it was a joke, that's what they said. And but his fellow students were so outraged that they withdrew their paintings from the exhibition until the society changed its mind and did hang Harbicone from Peggy's Hill. So there was a big stink about it, as you can imagine. And during the war years, Colin got married to Anne Hamblett in 1942. She was the daughter of an Anglican minister in Dunedin and a very good painter herself. In fact, at this stage, in the 1940s, she was a better painter than he was. And she was also several years older than Colin, and 3 or 4 years older, I think, and was regarded as the sort of star of the Dunedin Art School. And he looked up to her enormously. And but anyway, he persuaded her to marry him. And almost immediately they started having a family, and sadly, Anne stopped painting. She did work as an artist in other media. She became a very regular illustrator for the school journal, for example, but she didn't paint much after she first got married. And this dates from 1943, soon after they got married. They immediately moved to the Nelson area, where they worked they became agricultural labourers, essentially, working in tobacco fields and picking apples and orchards, and right through the war years, that was how they survived. And the Motueka River, Colin, they worked on farms at a place called Pungatultara, up the Motueka River, and he did quite a lot of drawings and paintings of people cavorting in the river, bathing and so forth. And this, I think, this is Anne, his wife, pregnant, not joining in the fun because of her pregnancy, I presume. But he did several paintings based on this figure sitting on the bank. This is a tiny little painting. It's only about so big, little watercolor. The mountain up the top, that's called the Crusader, and Colin did many, many studies of that particular mountain. So these elements appear in other works. One of the reasons I chose this work is that it's like a kind of synthesis of a lot of different motifs that he was using. The landscape, the figures in the water, the woman on the riverbank, all brought together in a single image. And I've cheated a bit this time and chosen 2 paintings for the year 1945. One of the many places that the McCahons lived was at Ruby Bay, which is near Mapua, if you know the Nelson area. And they had, I think, one child at the time, the first child, William, and they lived right on the spit close to the estuary at Mapua. And so they were so close to the water that when there was a high tide or wind, everything got covered in salt in their house. They lived pretty primitive lifestyle, I think you would have to say. They had no money. Anyway, at some point or other, William, who was, I think, 1 year old or just a babe, really, ran off into the sea and fell over, knocked over by a wave. And an elderly Maori woman called Harriet Simeon, who lived in the neighbourhood, saw this happen out her window and raced down to the beach and hauled this kid out of the water and saved his life, basically. And so Colin painted her portrait. And he said, yes, it's good, but it doesn't quite convey the whole tragedy of the Maori people, which is what I wanted it to convey. He had high ambitions always. You know, he wasn't just doing a portrait. He had other games afoot. And I think this is probably quite strongly influenced by Gauguin, Paul Gauguin's studies of Pacific Island peoples. And the one on the right, by this time they had moved away from the dangerous place down at the beach and was staying at a farm on Ruby Bay. And Colin had his first exhibition in Wellington. And when he came back, I think he was feeling exhilarated by the experience of having had his first exhibition, that it had been successful and people liked what he had done in many cases. And he gave expression to this feeling of effervescence and excitement by painting Spring, Ruby Bay, in 1945. So in 1946, the McCahons went back to Dunedin. Colin did two huge paintings of Otago Peninsula, and they weren't quite sure what to do next. Anyway, they decided they would go back to Nelson, and so they went back to Nelson, and they got a house in Tahunanui, the beach suburb out of Nelson. And they were there for about a year, through the year 1947. And it was a real breakthrough year for Colin as an artist. And out of the blue, he suddenly started painting religious pictures based traditional biblical subjects or subjects well known in Christian art, such as the entombment, the laying of Christ in the tomb after the crucifixion, or the crucifixion itself, or mother and child, and various other themes that he adopted. But the thing which was unusual was that he placed these events as if they were happening in New Zealand. So this is very much a Nelson landscape background to the events of the entombment. And he described the painting as being after Titian. And just as a little thumbnail on the right, I've shown the Titian's famous entombment in the Prado Museum in Madrid, which Colin took as his model. You'll see if you compare the two paintings that he's not in any way attempting to copy Titian. He's borrowed the structure of the painting, but he's very much using his own devices, simplifying the figures. The figures are quite crude in certain respects. He's trying to achieve a certain grandeur through a very rough sort of technique. One of the things about modernism was a desire to get away from what was known as academic painting. It's very, very skillful kinds of realism. people like Picasso and Braque and Modigliani, they wanted to bring a kind of primitive vigor back into art. And I think that Colin was greatly influenced by that. And that was the sort of quality that he wanted to bring into his painting as well. When these paintings first were shown, they were very controversial. People said, he can't even draw. But he could draw well enough to make the effects that he wanted. And that kind of primitive, almost childlike crudity and vigor was the quality that he was after. At the same time, he was also continued to paint landscape, and I think you'll see the similarities between the hills in the background and this painting of the Maitai Valley. He said of this particular painting, I broke through and finally learned how to paint the Nelson landscape. And so I'm keen to stay here. Having made this discovery, I want to exploit it as far as I can. I think it's this process of simplification, getting rid of unnecessary detail, strong rhythms, strong outlines. It's quite a remarkable painting. It's in the Hocken Library. And I've shown you one more example of the religious paintings from that year, 1947. And this one illustrates a technique that was also very controversial, in which Colin used speech bubbles derived from comics to convey what was happening in the painting. Eli, Eloi, lama sabachthani is what Christ says on the cross before he expires. You know, Lord, Lord, why hast thou forsaken me? And the various remarks, all of these phrases come from the Bible. And this was a particular moment that McCahon particularly loved, because I could speak about it for a long time, but it's based on a misunderstanding. Christ is speaking Aramaic, which was his language. That was his natural language, Aramaic. And Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani is in the Aramaic language. But the people around are Roman soldiers and Jews, and they think that he said Elijah will come and save him. And so there's a moment of mistranslation and confusion and ambiguity, and that's what attracts Colin about the moment. Was Christ saved, or was he deluded? You know, he did later a whole series about that very question. Is this a tragic painting, or is it a painting pointing to redemption and resurrection? It's the ambiguity that he particularly loves. This one, in 1948, he moved to Christchurch. The McCahons got thrown out of that house in Nelson because the landlord found out that he was an artist and threw him out. And the housing was so difficult in New Zealand at that time, he could not find anywhere to live, anywhere in the country. He would have gone anywhere, but he tried Central Otago, Wellington. There was just no houses that he could afford. So what happened was that the family split up, and his wife and children went back to Dunedin and lived with her parents. And Colin boarded with the artist Doris Lusk in Christchurch for a year before he managed to get his family together again. Anyway, this was painted just before he went to Christchurch, and it's called The Promised Land. And I think of it as a painting which sort of synthesizes a whole lot of issues and kinds of painting which he was working on at the time. It's got the landscape, two different kinds of landscape. It's got a portrait, a self-portrait of the artist on the left. It's got the figure of the angel in the sky. And it's got a still life of the jug and the candle, which is, of course, symbolic. and so it's a painting of multiple meanings, and almost like a kind of demonstration piece, if you like. And the notion of the promised land, which of course is biblical, Moses is going to lead the Jews who are in exile in Egypt through the Red Sea into the promised land. And that is one of the leading metaphors of Colin's work, and it's the title of my second volume. When eventually he learned how to paint the Canterbury landscape and did this radically simple painting called The Green Plain, extraordinarily radical painting for its time. He said in one of his letters, "I've done a painting which make people think they're going mad." That was his reaction to it. And that is almost like the DNA of Colin McCahon's art. Sky, land, contrast of colour, horizon, that recurs all the way through his career. And he continued in Christchurch to do religious paintings, crucifixions and so forth. Altogether, there were about 40 paintings of religious subjects in that period, 1947 to 1952. And this is one of the most elaborate. I think he did 8 crucifixions. This is one of the most elaborate. For some reason, he wouldn't, after having initially exhibited this painting, he never exhibited it again, and he sort of hid it. And it wasn't until many, many years later that he brought it out of hiding. And eventually it was bought by the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra. But it's too complicated a painting to say much about here, but notice that it divides into 2 landscapes. These hills are quite different from the landscape behind the crucifixion, and there's a sort of division in the painting into 2. And on the one side of the division there's the man obsessed with the crucifixion. On the other side is the mother and child. You can see them as a holy family, if you like, or you can see it as autobiographical and about the conflicts in his own family that resulted from his religious obsession. And I love the rhyming between the bough of laden fruit and the skulls. This is the kind of contrasting technique that Colin often uses in his work. So in 1953 he moves to Tarangi, and his work changes again. He became obsessed with the kauri forest, individual kauri trees. This is probably the masterpiece of the kauris. He did maybe 50 paintings of kauri trees. This one is in the Hocken Library, bought by Charles Brash. In 1951, Colin went to Australia, paid for by Charles Brash, to study old master paintings in the National Gallery of Victoria. And while he was there, he met an old lady, an old woman, who was a painter with a broken leg. Her name was Mary Coburn Mercer, and Colin found out that she had studied Cubism in Paris before the First World War, and was known to people like Picasso and Braque. And Colin asked her if she would give him lessons. So she gave him 3 days of lessons about Cubism, and he said they were the 3 most important days of my life. And so when he came back to New Zealand, everything was seen through a kind of Cubist perspective. And this painting is an example of that, like the circular surrounding figure that comes from Braque, and the multiple perspectives are of course, Cubism. 1955, he did a few portraits through the 50s, including this amazing picture, which is very Picasso-like in certain respects. You know, like Picasso, the nose is both full frontal and profile at the same time. And it's quite a scarifying painting, I think, in some ways. It recently sold at auction in Wellington for $400,000. And living on the shores of French Bay, he painted the water and the harbour over and over and over and over in many different styles. I can only take the time to illustrate this one. This is one of the 1957 style, where he breaks up the surface of the painting into tiny little lozenges of colour, rather like pointillism, the associated with Seurat at the end of the 19th century. Then in 58, Colin went to America and spent 4 months in America. He basically went as a museum authority and professional and studied museum management and that sort of thing. But of course, he took as much time as he could to look at the great museums in North America, and he was interested both in the history, you know, historical paintings that he could see there, as well as up-to-the-minute contemporary painting. And when he came back to New Zealand, his style changed radically. It was an absolute watershed in his career. And one of the first paintings he did when he returned was this one called Northland Panels. Now those panels are, I'll just mention some of the ways in which this is a new event for him. The panels are unframed, they're just loose canvas. They're each about 2 meters tall, so it's huge. So the increase in scale was one thing. Also using unstretched canvas rather than traditional stretched canvas. Also, he's using house paints, not traditional oils. And from this point in his career, he hardly ever used traditional oils again, but used Dulux and Solpar and house paints and roof paints. When acrylics turned up, he immediately turned to acrylics, and most of his later paintings are done in acrylics. But the mixture of abstraction and realism, you know, some of these are quite recognizable hills and clouds and scenes that you might see if you were driving through the Northland countryside. Others are quite abstract, like the first and the last panels. And he sort of vacillated back and forth between realism and abstraction, partly influenced by some of the painting he'd seen in America, particularly that of Richard Diebenkorn, a West Coast painter. Another of the series painted after he came back was called the Elias series, which is based on that moment in the Bible. We saw the crucifixion earlier on. But in this case, Colin had moved away from realism towards abstraction and text. And so he puts the words of the Bible and abstract shapes and colors in order to explore the same religious issues about faith and doubt, which are a major preoccupation in his life. And the Elias series, about 15 of them, all painted in that 1 year. This is the most gorgeous of them, Let Be, Let Be. You can see the T-cross emerging in his work, in this work as well. And another group of works after he came back from America, he simplified his color range towards black and white and to a kind of fairly fundamental sort of symbolism. the upper part of this painting is, you can see it as perhaps a waterfall falling through a dark landscape, but the lower part is almost purely symbolic. This is the saltire, the St. Andrew's cross, another form of the cross. And this is the point at which I end my volume 1. And I love this particular photograph of Colin that came from the Woman's Weekly in 1961. And he's surrounded by a lot of the paintings. You can see Let Be there. You can see the cross there. Some of the religious paintings from the 40s, just surrounded by examples of his work, mostly from the late 50s. All right. So in the 1960s, Colin has moved into central Auckland, and the first series that he does is much more abstract than most of the paintings he had done prior to this. And one of the painters who greatly impressed him in America was Mondrian, the Dutch painter. And although this doesn't look at all like a Mondrian, Mondrian was a huge influence on his style. And Mondrian, of course, one of the things that influenced him about Mondrian was that Mondrian had started out as a realist and progressively got rid of nature until he was completely abstract. And Colin was going through a somewhat similar process himself and regarded Mondrian as a kind of mentor. And so the first big series he did was called the Gate series. And Colin's idea was that a gate is something that is either a barrier or a way through. And symbolically, that's what those paintings are about. They're seeking a way through these big obstacles. And that might be in terms of politics or social life or belief, or there are many different levels at which that symbolism can operate. These two, in the early 60s, he started to get interested in Maori art, and particularly Maori design, and the koru shapes from kowhaiwhai patterns on marae rafters had a big influence on him. And, now is the hour when we must say goodbye, which is, of course, a Maori song. The imagery in that painting is the colour, to some extent the colour and also the shape of Maori design. And here's another example of the promised land image coming back. Was this the promised land? A recurrent theme in his work. But those abstract paintings, the Gate series and so forth, they weren't very popular. And Colin was rather disappointed by the reception of them. And for one moment in his life, he sort of hesitated and said, am I on the wrong track? And so he backed off and retreated for a few years into landscape painting again. And these works on the screen are an example of the sort of paintings that he did, having retreated from abstraction towards the landscape. But he says, now I'm not painting any particular place. It's not North Otago or Canterbury or Titirangi. It's New Zealand, but it's abstracted. So it's a kind of landscape painting that has passed through abstraction, if you like. And then after those are 8 big panels, each 2 meters tall. There were 2 sets of them. They're a wonderful series. One's in Te Papa, the other's in the Auckland Art Gallery. Landscape theme and variations, he calls them. And then below, there's an example of the waterfall, which became a very popular motif. In 1964, he did hundreds of them. And they're important in his career because they were popular for the first time in his career, and he had almost a sellout show in 1964, and he couldn't believe it, because previous to that he had sold almost nothing. But the waterfall images really caught on, and a lot of people started buying McCahon's work from that point on, and he became quite a successful painter towards the latter part of his life, successful in monetary terms. So an important development in the mid-60s was his interest in Catholic symbolism. He got a job with an architect to paint windows for a chapel in Remuera, and it required him to study Roman Catholic iconography. And from that point onwards, Catholic images and symbols begin to appear frequently in his work, like XP. Anybody know what XP is? It's the first two letters of the word Christ in Greek, and it's what's known as a Christogram. A Christogram is an abbreviated form of the name of Christ, and Colin was very keen on Christograms and painted a great many of them. But phrases from Catholic liturgy like Agnus Dei, Dona Nobis Pacem, Lamb of God, please give us our peace. I like that one because of the way it combines text, abstraction, landscape, all brought in together. It's one of those synthesizing paintings. South Canterbury landscape. So he did a few paintings of South Canterbury during his career, around about 1968. And this is one of the best. It's quite a large painting, about this big. You should be very nice to Jenny Gibbs. Maybe she'll give it to you. And towards the end of the 60s, he also got very interested in Maori language. And one of his children married a Maori, Victoria. She married a man from Tainui. And this is the Tainui whakapapa. You know how Maoris chant their genealogies, and so Collins is a version of a chant, except that it's a painting, and he uses different intensities of paint and sizes of words in order to convey something equivalent to the human voice chanting a whakapapa. So this is quite a famous painting now because it sold at auction 2 years ago for 1.6 million, which is, I think, the highest price at auction of any New Zealand painting. In 1970, he built a big studio out at Muriwai, and he was able to paint on a much larger scale than he had before. And some of the paintings are truly enormous, 7 meters long, like the big I Am, which is in the National Gallery of Canberra. This is 2 meters by 2 meters, and he did a lot of these textual paintings as well. He was given a new translation of the Bible called the New English Bible, which came out in the 60s, and Colin really loved it. And once that he got hold of that translation of the Bible, he never used any other. All of his textual paintings are taken from that 1961 New English Bible. Living out at Muriwai became very important to him. He had now left the art school, was painting full time. He had a studio in town and a studio out at Muriwai, which is about 35 k's from the city. And it was a much bigger studio, so he could paint on a bigger scale. And he just loved the landscape out at Muriwai. And I've chosen this example because it uses the features that Colin loved. Here's the cliff and the rock stack that I mentioned earlier, and these recur over and over and over. And the island offshore, he sees as Moby Dick, the white whale. It's covered with bird shit, so it's guano, so it looks like a white whale. And Tui Ka celebrates Muriwai Beach. Tui Ka was one of his grandchildren, and this kid had apparently thrown his arms out in ecstasy at the vision of the landscape, and that was the moment that Colin wanted to capture in this particular painting. You can see the landscape of the Muriwai in this painting as well, the two blocks. And this is another one which depends on the contrast between figure and ground, or ground and figure. Tatimu's low tide, he got very interested in Maori myth and the myth of the passage of the spirit after death up the west coast beaches, including Muriwai, to the jumping off point at Te Reinga. And that's what basically this painting is about. This is in Parliament Buildings in Wellington, this particular painting. And it's another one of those versions of the Stations of the Cross. And the little, it looks like a strip of film, doesn't it? And each little passage is a station in my reading of the work. And I am walking north, so his walking along the beach at Muriwai was sort of like a reenactment of the Stations of the Cross, part of his process of religious meditation. So he's responding to the landscape, thinking about religious matters, and also, in this instance, remembering his great friend James K. Baxter, who had died just recently, and who was also a Catholic. And he imagines Baxter travelling up the western beaches to Te Reinga. This is a huge painting, over 2 meters long. Radically simple, but majestic, sublime, in my judgment. And I mentioned that the Stations of the Cross became a recurrent motif. Well, often in the later years, he wouldn't render the stations figuratively or by landscape, but simply by number. And a lot of his later paintings have just numbers in them. And here we have the numbers 1 to 14, which are, of course, the 14 stations. And you have the T cross and INRI. Does anybody know what that stands for? Jesus, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. It's Latin, I think. INRI. Jesu, Nazareth, Rex. I forget the precise Latin, but it's one of those Christograms that he loved to use. This used to belong to Ralph Hottery, this painting, and is still part of the Hottery collection. Well, and so the story goes. I mean, by the 70s, he's enormously prolific, working on many, many different themes. He got very interested in Maori history, and he got a commission to do a mural for the Uraweras, for the conservation headquarters in the Uraweras. And out of that commission, he got very interested in Tuhoi, the tribe of the Uraweras, and in Rua Kanana, the great prophetic leader of the Tuhoi people. So that explains that particular one. And the Jump series, again, it's based on that landscape out at Muriwai. Some of his later paintings look like cartoons or like diagrams in a textbook. This process of simplification of his methodology continues right through the later years. And in the Jump paintings, he said, imagine what happens to a spirit travelling up the west coast of the North Island, and it comes to these great cliffs at Muriwai. What does it do? It jumps. So the jump is jumping up and over. And he did a whole series of those. And he was picked up on all sorts of things. He watched his grandson playing noughts and crosses with his mother, and used that as a basis for a series of paintings as well. He did 2 series of 7. 7 plus 7 is 14. So again, he's behind the works are the Stations of the Cross. The first series is in black and white, and you'll notice that the crosses always win. And they're not so much the X, but the T shape. And the crosses win here too. But in the second series, it never works out. Nobody wins. It's a kind of stalemate. So I think all this has symbolic connotations for him as well. This one's closely related to the red ones. Mondrian's Last Chrysanthemum, it's a beautiful painting, but it's also a terrifying painting because it's about nuclear fallout. And written at the bottom of the picture on the right is the word ash. So it's quite a startling painting. You think it's absolutely beautiful, and then it turns out to be a terrifying vision. This is called Angels in Bed, one of the very powerful late series, based on several friends of his who were ill and in hospital, and he imagined them lying in bed, on bed of pain or bed of death, surrounded by angels. So the figure at the bottom is symbolic of the bed, and the white rectangles are symbolic of the hovering angels. And this was from a series called The 5 Wounds of Christ. I won't pause to discuss that further. We're nearly there. This was the last big series of colourful paintings that he did called Truth from the King Country. And these are quite tiny. They're only about this big. And they're painted on canvas boards that you can buy in an art shop, just little canvas boards. He did about 40 of them and mostly gave them away to friends. But they, of course, utilised the T cross. But it's also a bridge. It's like a viaduct in the King Country, part of the North Island. Beautiful series. Again, you see the T shape. This one, May His Light Shine, Tower Cross. It's representing Cornwall Park, the mountain in the hill in the middle of Auckland, and with a lot of other elements as well. And this is called Storm Warning. Was a painting that painted right towards the end of his life. It's the last painting in which he used imagery, the stormy clouds at the bottom, and it's a very pessimistic vision of the future where nobody will care about anything but money. And he gave the painting to Victoria University, gave it to them, and after his death they sold it for $1 million in order to build their art gallery, which always struck me as a terrible irony. And this is the very last painting that he completed. And his last 4 paintings are based on the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. A very pessimistic philosopher. And Colin wrote out these texts. Some people argue that they indicate that he lost his faith at the end and ended his life in despair. I personally don't follow that way of thinking, but I think it is incredibly eloquent that he left, the last painting left this black void without any images on it. And this was the painting, it was the last painting he finished. He could no longer paint after this point. He lived on for another 3 or 4 years. And when he did eventually die in 1987, and his studio was finally unlocked, this painting was found upside down on the studio floor. And just a little photograph of Colin, a humble man, an ordinary workman in some ways, not looking like a genius by any means, but standing on the corner of K Road, waiting to cross at the lights. And this is the version of my two books, which are in a slipcase. You can't buy them anymore, unfortunately. They all sold out like hot cakes. But that's the end of my story. And I'm sorry for going on so long.